Hello and welcome to the Ideas Factory. I'm Naghma. Joining me is Professor Pant. Uh, Defense Minister Rajnath Singh is back from a 3-day visit to Russia for the 75th and Victory Parade celebrations, where the Indian contingent was also present. So were the Chinese contingent, along with the Chinese Defense Minister. This is happening in the backdrop of the Galwan clash between India and China. And the question, along with that, the India, China, Russia trilateral has also taken place. And then there are the questions of the relevance, questions over the relevance of an India, Russia, China trilateral in the face of the Galwan face-off. We've also seen other developments like Mike Pompeo's comment on moving the American troops from Europe to counter the PLA. So all that in this episode of the Ideas Factory. I would like to begin with India, Russia and China. We've seen Rajnath Singh's visit. We know Russia has made it very clear that India and China can sort out the differences, are very capable of sorting out their problems on their own. And Russia is not really going to play the role of a peacemaker. Nevertheless, Russia's role in this situation is still very, very important. What are your views, Harsh, on this? Especially when we see that after the Galwan clash, we've also had a virtual RIC. And what really is the relevance at this point?
Well, it's quite interesting, Naghma. I think, on the one hand, the Russia question stands independently of RIC because Russia is such an important actor as far as India is concerned, Indian defense and strategic priorities are concerned, and also the fact that Russia is increasingly getting close to China. So there is a sense that India needs to tread very cautiously when it comes to Russia. And perhaps Rajnath Singh's visit was also an important, an important aspect of his visit was to make sure that Russia continues to maintain and continues to sustain India's defense needs, because that is something that, we still, for 60 to 70% of our defense needs still are maintained by Russia. So clearly that is an important vector for us to preserve. But I think India is also very cautious of the fact that Russia's changing geopolitical requirements, the fact that Russia is at loggerheads with the West, and increasingly its foreign policy priorities are through the prism of that engagement with the West. So the China factor for Russia is very, very crucial. Despite various pronouncements over the last several years and decades that Russians and the Chinese will never come close, we have seen that they have actually come very close to each other. Russia, in fact, is more of a proponent or more of an antagonistic respondent to the question of Indo-Pacific. You know that earlier this year, when the Russian foreign minister was in India for Raisina dialogue, he was the one who challenged the Indo-Pacific narrative more prominently than perhaps even the Chinese have done. So clearly, there is an alignment happening there, which might make life difficult for India. But India certainly would like Russia to remain as engaged with it as it has been in the past. And Rajnath Singh's visit was clearly an attempt to underscore that need. Now, the other question is, of course, the RIC and what its evaluation is at this particular juncture. RIC, Russia, India, China trilateral is a product of early 1990s, when the whole idea was to challenge American unipolarity. The three countries continue to remain proponents of multipolar world, and at that point in time, it was seen as a very important initiative to bring together these countries who were actually against certain aspects of American foreign policy, and also standing up for a certain vision of multilateral global governance. So as you put it today, in the context of what is happening between India and China, the whole relevance of RIC itself is in question. And I would say even RIC, I think the whole relevance of BRICS is in question, is under question. And I think India will have to seriously evaluate what it is getting out of these platforms. And I think it is not without relevance that if you read the comments of the External Affairs Minister, they are targeted primarily at China, making a case that, look, we can all continue to talk of norms and principles in global politics, but ultimately it's the practice of foreign policy that determines the outcome. and it should determine the kind of world order that we are going to live in. Now, if countries like China continue to, disregard, priorities of India, continues to disregard the red lines of India. I mean, he did not mention the countries; he mentioned it more vaguely. But the idea was that if you do not have countries that respect each other's national interests, then clearly a platform like this cannot be a precursor to a kind of a world order that at one point RICs thought it can become, or even BRICS for that matter can become, thought it would become. So I think the challenge here is for India to steer RIC in a direction that perhaps also heeds to Indian sensitivities. If that happens, well and good, India can take it forward. If that does not happen, then I think India will have to seriously reevaluate what it means by being, by engaging in this kind of a platform. Apart from the fact that it gives you one extra and additional point of engagement with the Russians, which I think is something that I think India needs.
Yeah. So you're saying basically RIC, be it RIC or BRICS or even Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, these platforms have lost their relevance, or they're actually not playing the role that they were meant to play. And the dream of Asian dominance, there was so much talk about around it, and all these platforms were supposed to be furthering that dream. But is it buckling now under if I may use the word, a power-hungry China, or the Chinese imperial overstretch that we are witnessing, and Russia is kind of neutral here?
Yes, I think that the multilateral order that we are looking at today, and the kind of plurilateral arrangements that India has become part of over the last decade, are increasingly under stress. And they are under stress not simply for India, but for the entire world order. So in a sense, fragmentation of that multilateral order is going to be the norm. And India will have to respond to that challenge, treading a bit cautiously, because certainly we don't want institutions to fall and to crumble, but they are crumbling under the weight of their own contradictions. India is not doing anything. I mean, if you look at China's overweening role, China's dominance over these institutions, and discomfort that other countries feel with China's dominance, it's clear that the present extant multilateral arrangements cannot work, cannot function. So India will have to find alternatives. India will have to find those countries that are more convergent with India on regional and global policy issues, and build coalitions around them. Now, one idea that India has proposed in the recent years is issue-based coalitions. We are not non-aligned anymore. We are aligning with countries on the basis of issues, and we can align with everyone and anyone. This is the message that Indian foreign policy, that Indian policymakers have been trying to give. And that is, I think, in some ways that had been happening. But the pressure that Chinese dominance and Chinese assertiveness is putting on various other platforms, that means that India's distance from China will contribute to a fragmentation of this order. If India and China cannot work together, then certainly the kind of Asian dominance in these international institutions will not happen. If India and China will work at cross purposes, then these institutions will not be effective. If India and China are not working together on global policy issues, on global issues, or on issues of global governance, then certainly global order and global governance will get affected. And I think that is a choice that increasingly India feels China has to make, because it is for China to decide that does it want a global order or does it want a global disorder, as it seems Chinese behavior seems to be predicating itself upon.
It looks like China is just furthering global disorder right now, because if you see with every passing day, more and more nations are complaining of an increased aggression from China. China is not shying away from displaying its economic heft and the aggression as well. South China Sea, East China Sea, Taiwan, there has been an increasing aggression from China. But at the same time, do you think it's a very challenging task for India to build an international consensus as far as Beijing's aggression goes, because European Union's foreign affairs chief said that there is no military threat from China. Of course, probably he's looking at their own geographical borders. But America is talking of, Pompeo spoke of shifting the forces from Europe to counter PLA.
Yeah, I see. I think any, any attempt at this scale is a very difficult one in very basic terms, because you are trying to create a global consensus on an issue which is quite contentious for most countries, because clearly relationship with China is important. It is important for all countries for economic reasons. It is also important for various countries to have a stable world order. They do not want to create unnecessary instability. But I think we have come to a point now where instability is being driven by Chinese behavior, and increasingly in a manner that makes it almost impossible for other actors to ignore it. So in the last, and this is, I think, those countries that are more proactively engaged in the Indo-Pacific, for example, are increasingly becoming more vocal about it. So whether it is America, as you mentioned, Mike Pompeo, or whether it is countries like Japan, Australia, Vietnam, and Philippines, they are becoming more proactive. They recognize the challenge they face. Philippines, for example, at one point in time gave up its agreement with the, decided to undo that agreement with the Americans for the base, but soon they recognized that is not going to happen. So Duterte conveniently called American forces back. So in a sense, we are all passing through a phase, all nations are passing through a phase where adjusting to this new normal is a very difficult challenge. But increasingly, I think global consensus is crystallizing. European Union, as you mentioned, European Union is somewhat of a misfit in this, because European Union does not even, though they are trying to say it now that they are a geopolitical actor, they do not see themselves as a geopolitical actor. They see themselves more of a normative player in international relations. Now, if that is if that is their point of view vis-a-vis their own role in global affairs, then clearly there is going to be a challenge for them to shift their perspective, and it would take them some time. But I think there are others in the European Union which have a very different point of view. So, for example, UK technically is not now anymore in European Union, but UK has a very different point of view about Asian security, about Indo-Pacific status. Similarly, France, for example, I'm sure France would have an independent view on this matter, which would be very different from the point of view that Brussels is articulating. So I think we are moving into a phase where even countries, even entities that want to keep themselves away from this churn will find it very difficult, because there is, at the end of the day, either you are for certain norms, either you are for certain normative values which China is challenging, or you become subservient to the Chinese worldview. And I don't think most countries in the world at this point at least are ready to just succumb to Chinese pressure. So they will they will have to come to terms with that, and they will have to articulate a more robust response. But for India, I think India should really be open-eyed about it. India should really, at the end, it is something that, it is a battle that India will have to fight on its own. We should not expect others to fight our battles with China. This is a very complicated struggle with China. It's a geopolitical, geoeconomic struggle that India is engaged with. And we will have some friends who will stand by us. But I think predicating India's policy on other countries' behavior might be a bit of a short-sighted move. And I don't think Indian policymakers would do that.
So while India will have to fight its own battle, and we will have some friends who will support us from time to time on different issues, and that's the case probably with all the countries in the current geopolitical scenario. There are no permanent allies and no permanent foes, and different countries are supporting each other on different matters differently. But even for America, if we look at the move or the announcement by Mike Pompeo now as something which should be, which India should be happy about, that they are moving their forces from Europe to Asia to counter PLA. They're doing it because their strategic interest is vested in this move. So how do you really see this move? Will this happen really? There are other views that it may not happen, it is just a statement, but how do you see this announcement?
Well, fundamentally, it's a structural requirement for America to move its forces from Europe to Indo-Pacific. Because if America is serious about protecting its own supremacy in the global order, then they will have to do something about their reducing their declining credibility in the Indo-Pacific. And for a long time, this has been a big point of contention. During this process started during Obama administration, which he called, the rebalance to India, to Asia Pacific.
Yes.
Now that rebalance actually never happened. It was only on the paper. The force postures never really changed as far as America was concerned, and America continued to focus on Middle East, and American forces in Europe continued to be there. I think now under pressure because of various reasons, and using the present multiple crises that are brewing in the Indo-Pacific as an opportunity, America is using this to transition to a new phase. Whether or not it happens on the ground operationally, we will have to wait and see. But my sense is eventually it will happen. It may not happen even under Mr. Trump, but it will happen. The question is, as far as India is concerned, of course, if it happens, it's a good move as far as India is concerned. It opens up another pressure point on China. And any additional pressure on China is good at the moment as far as India is concerned, which has very few leverage vis-a-vis China at the moment. So anything that puts pressure on China is good. But I think we should be clear-eyed about what the Americans are doing. Americans are doing it because they need to move their forces from Europe to Indo-Pacific, because they need to sustain their preeminence in Indo-Pacific, because ultimately it's a question of American credibility. And ultimately, it's a question of what kind of a regional order in the Indo-Pacific emerges. It will have benefits for India, but it is not that America is doing this because of India. And I think, to be fair to Americans, Mike Pompeo did not mention that they are doing it for anyone. They said that they are moving it because they have to challenge PLA and take on PLA, and PLA is creating trouble on multiple fronts, be it India, be it South China Sea. But I think for India, if that happens, and already you see a lot of maritime, for example, American aircraft carriers, 3 of them are in around China's vicinity, have been in China's vicinity for a week. I think any pressure on China is good, but ultimately the battle on the Himalayas will have to be fought by the Indians and by Indian, and therefore Indian capabilities would matter. India's own strength would matter. And that's where I think India should be focused.
So how do you really assess India's capability? There is no question on our military capabilities and our forces, but the political will and the sustained foreign policy of the foreign policy towards China, minus all the illusions that have surrounded India's policy towards China. Respective prime ministers have been very, very forgiving towards China's stance, China's moves, incursions, but we need to kind of do away with all those illusions, and the political will has to be there. We've seen the talks at military level, diplomatic level. We've seen now it's a time for probably a political call and some strong statement last week finally from the MEA. So vis-a-vis India, China, where are we right now?
I think we are at a stage where there is a broader consensus that has solidified that something has changed in Sino-Indian relations, and the new normal of these relations would be this trend, which is going to be very a very turbulent phase in Sino-Indian relations. So if you see successive statements from the MEA, from the External Affairs Minister, and the Chinese Indian ambassador to China, his recent interview, all of them are very, very categorical in asserting certain things that I think in the past we have not done. We have been, relatively cautious about these things, which is, I think, par for the course when it comes to diplomatic statements. But we have never heard the kind of statements that we are hearing now, which means that basically onus on stabilizing the relationship now, as far as India is concerned, is on China. China has to demonstrate its willingness that it is ready to reshape the relationship and take the relationship in a new direction, in a positive direction, and it has to show its goodwill. Therefore, the demands are restoration of status quo ante as on April this year, the ground forces, seizing of all the construction that is happening, and starting a new dialogue. Now, I don't think China is going to budge on most of these accounts, and to whatever limited information we have, that information seems to suggest that China is going nowhere in a hurry. And similarly, India, I think, is preparing for a long haul. I think policymakers recognize that they are not going to, that this crisis is not going to diffuse in a short while. And we are going to both ramp up our military posturing on the border, as well as continue with an aggressive dialogue with China moving forward. And I think this is going to be a very, very critical phase, because both on the LAC, because of ramping up of militaries, there might be issues of escalation, and diplomatically, because we have drawn some very clear lines, diplomatically escalation might also be possible. Because both, if you see the statements, both from the Chinese side and from the Indian side, they're quite remarkable in the kind of red lines that they're drawing for the other side. So I think we are entering a new phase in Sino-Indian relations, and which is going to be very turbulent. That's the only assessment you can make at the moment. And it has to also be seen in the context of the larger trends in Asian and Indo-Pacific geopolitics, which we were discussing before, whether it is American moving in the area with bigger force posture, or whether other countries like Japan, Australia, Vietnam, Indonesia also responding to the China challenge in their own ways. And I think somewhere in that matrix, you will have to situate this India-China border problem, which will continue to be a lightning rod for both sides, at least in the short to medium term.
So before we end this conversation, today's conversation, I would just like your comment, a quick comment on a rather interesting, or if I may say bizarre, statement by Imran Khan. What did he really mean when he called Osama bin Laden a martyr and said we were ashamed of, there is a lot of opposition within Pakistan too, from the opposition parties, from former foreign minister Khwaja Asif, and Bilawal Bhutto. They're all saying that you please do not give in to the extremism that Osama bin Laden portrayed. Why was it a faux pas, or how do you see this comment?
I don't think it was a faux pas. I think more likely, if you recall, even before Mr. Khan had, in one of his earlier interviews also had refused to talk of bin Laden as a terrorist. So I think he comes from a school of thought which continued to see bin Laden as very important as part of the foreign policy or security framework of Pakistan. And given how under the influence of the military he is, and in military intelligence apparatus he is, I think everyone has given any pretension that he's his own man. I think in that sense it would be very difficult for him to take a stance that would in some ways go against the military establishment. And military establishment, of course, continues to play both sides in this equation. We also know that this comes at a time when the US State Department report on Pakistani activities on terrorism has also been very complicated, and that has complicated the discourse for Pakistan. My sense is that this is something for Pakistani audience, Mr. Khan's own constituency and Mr. Khan's own ideological inclinations that prevent him from clearly articulating an anti-terrorist or anti-extremist orientation. But I think this is something that Pakistan will continue to jostle till such time as their main foreign policy and security focus does not change to a more positive one, rather than relying continuously on terror groups for taking on their adversaries.